everybody. Welcome to my shop. I'm Mike Potvin, and today I'm going to be answering more email subscriber questions, this time about building guitar necks. Last time we talked about bodies. That was a lot of fun, but the more questions, or I get more questions about building necks, so that's what we'll tackle today. And as I mentioned, this is an email subscriber live stream. So if you're watching live now, that means you're an email subscriber. Thanks for that. I appreciate that you trusted me with your email address and not to fill up your inbox. And if you're watching this in the future, the replay, then maybe consider subscribing to my email list. And I can let you know the next time I do this. And you can be here and join us live and ask me your questions, and I can answer them in real time. So let's dive right in. I think I can probably do this in about an hour and 15. There were an awful lot of questions, but I chopped them up into groups, and we'll try to cover them all in that hour or hour and 15. So let's get rolling here. These are the kind of questions that I got. And you might find it interesting. I sent out a survey and asked everyone what they wanted to know about building guitar necks. And I also asked them if they were getting ready to build their first neck or if they had built a neck. And 42% of people said they had not built a neck yet, which I thought was pretty cool, that 42% of people wanted to build a neck, but for various reasons, they had not. And they gave me their reasons, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that a lot of them sound like me when I first started. I don't know where to start. I'm not confident enough to try. Some of them were just super honest and said, you know what, I'm too chicken to try, Mike. And that was me way back when I was just woodworker Mike. And I was playing my shiny Mexican-made Telecaster. I looked at it for the first time with my woodworker eyes, and I said, "Oh, I could probably make this body. I think I have all the tools I need." And then my next thought was, but of course I couldn't make a neck because a neck is rocket science. And so, spoiler alert, a couple of months later, I just decided, damn the torpedoes, I'm going to try this. And I made my first neck. And it wasn't great, but I learned an awful lot from it. So if you haven't started your first neck yet, you're not alone. There are a lot of things that might be holding you back. And hopefully tonight we'll try and get you unstuck and moving forward. So let's jump ahead here. And this is one of the more popular questions is, I don't know what order to do things in. And like all things with guitar building, there's a million different ways you can do anything. But this set of 8 steps is kind of roughly how I might attack you see in the picture here, a Fender style bolt-on neck. You can, some of these are negotiable. Like if you look at 1 and 2, it's make a fretboard and make the neck shaft. You could do those in the opposite order. And a few of these are not negotiable. Look at number 4, glue up. You better make sure you put the truss rod in first before you glue it up, because you can't put it in after you've glued it up. So try to work your way through the order of operations, thinking about what will the next step allow me to do, or what's no longer possible after that step. And these are by no means in depth. I could probably do a live stream on probably all 8 of these, but we'll touch on a lot of these in the questions that are coming up in the next few slides. So let me take a quick look at the chat here. Oh, Chris says he's glad he was able to make it to the live today. Well, I'm glad you're here too, Chris. This is always a lot of fun. I quite enjoy talking to people. You sometimes find that guitar building can be a very solitary thing. Your spouse or your co-workers at your day job may not be into guitar building, so you're the only one of your type in your friend group, and you don't have anyone else to talk to. So this is a lot of fun to be able to chat with you. Before we move on to the next slide, though, let me know in the chat if you've built a neck, and if you haven't, then tell me what's holding you back. And if you have, maybe tell me, I don't know, what kind of necks you like to build or how many you've built. Just give me some info on that. Oh, Pat's here just in time. That's awesome. Good to see you, Pat. All right. So before we get into the questions, I thought I would give you my #1 tip. I get a lot of emails from people. They're asking me about, will your templates work with this particular type of neck that I already have? Or what if I didn't want to make a neck? And I can suss out, even if they don't say it in so many words, that what they're trying to say is I don't want to, or I don't know how to build a neck. And the tip I always give them is you should absolutely try. And the way that I suggest you start trying is, you'll see here, take the pressure off, build a practice neck. And by that, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a neck that will end up usable that you bolt on a guitar. So you'll notice that I say here, don't put a truss rod in it. Use really inexpensive wood. The whole point of the thing is to go through the process, get some mistakes out of the way, and start building up some chops that you'll eventually put to use on a more expensive neck blank. So start with something cheap, pine, poplar, even plain maple. A 3-foot piece of plain maple from your local lumber yard is not going to break your bank. Before we roll on here, I see all kinds of questions coming in here. Let me just take a quick look and see if it's anything that's not covered in the next couple of slides. Mike, haven't built a neck before, but it seems very complicated. That is statement number 14B, Mike. You're not alone. I get that one a lot. And it's how will I put it? I always tell people that the neck is the guitar. So a body is basically, it's a slab that you mount all the hardware on. It's not terribly complicated, and it's pretty forgiving. Like, you don't even have to cut a body shape in a body blank. You can leave it a giant rectangle and it still functions as a guitar. But the neck is where there are many opportunities to have things go wrong, and your guitar will contain no guitar because of those things that went wrong. So the neck, if you're a techie nerd, it's the interface like the keyboard on your computer. It's where all the smarts needs to be. Having said that, do not be afraid. Grab that piece of pine, poplar, whatever it is, inexpensive, make a terrible neck and find out what was hard, and then you'll know what to practice so that you can start making great necks. Anyway, practice, take the pressure off with inexpensive wood, and that has gotten so many people unstuck and at least moving forward to find out what they need to learn next. You would be surprised how many people have taken that advice and run with it. Who else is here? I like this. Brian, gathering up the courage, wood is purchased. I'm glad that you've forced yourself past the point of no return. If the wood is there, then that means you got to move forward. Now, if it was expensive wood, Brian, absolutely don't start with that wood. Grab that piece of pine and practice with it. I sometimes still, when I'm prototyping things, I start out with 2 necks side by side, one made out of poplar usually, and one made out of whatever, mahogany or maple or whatever it's intended to be, so I can get my mistakes out of the way. That's one of the best pieces of advice I can give you. What else have we got here? This is great. David says, I've been building necks for about 5 years as a hobby builder. Not as difficult as it seems. Typically bolt-on ones, only done a few set necks. Yeah, Mrs. Potvin Guitars has taught me not to use a phrase that I used to use a lot, and that is, building guitars is not rocket science. And she's finally got me to understand that that's what rocket scientists say. Or as an old guitar teacher of mine used to say, when he'd try to teach me something new and I would say, man, this seems like rocket science, he would stop and say, what do you think rocket scientists say when they find something difficult to do? Oh man, this is like playing guitar. So that and Mrs. Potvin Guitars drove it home for me. You don't know what you don't know, but start trying to learn what you don't know, and eventually it will seem a lot less intimidating. Anyway, let's get rolling here. on some more of the questions that were emailed in. So here's one. Is it harder to make a set neck or a bolt-on neck? With one exception that we'll touch on in a second, the necks are really no different. It's how tightly they fit in the neck pocket. So a bolt-on neck is the same as a set neck for the most part, except for how snug the neck pocket is to make a proper glue joint. So if you look at the images I've got here, the top one is what we could call, I don't know, a PRS style or a telly type heel. And it's pretty straightforward to make. It's no different than a bolt-on neck. But the exception is the ever popular Les Paul style or Gibson heel that you see in the lower picture. There's a lot going on with that heel. There's shoulders to cut. There's a lip under the heel on the back side. And don't forget, there's an angle baked into there as well. So basically, that heel contains compound angles that almost certainly require a jig of some kind to cut correctly. That is definitely harder to do than a PRS style bolt-on heel, which is basically just a long telly heel. So that's the simple answer to that question, I think. The tip that I give most people is for your first build, take some more pressure off and start with a bolt-on Fender style neck and get that to work. It's a little bit more forgiving. If you make a neck and bolt it on your Fender style body and find out that your neck has issues and worst case you have to abandon ship on it, you can just unbolt it. If you've glued in a set neck, that's a whole order of magnitude more difficult to recover from. So start with a bolt-on neck. Let me do a quick check on the chat here, maybe have a sip. All right, who's in the chat here? Scarf joint, I see a scarf joint mention here. Scarf joints are my next hurdle as well. Well, keep stand by. We're coming up on scarf joints. I got a lot of questions about scarf joints. So is that good? Is everybody good on bolt-on versus set neck? We'll push on then. I get a few questions about this. How do you make a one-piece neck? So if you're not super familiar, at some point in Fender's history, they decided it would be a cool idea to make necks that don't have a separate fretboard. If you look at the heel of the, let me make it a little bit bigger here, the heel in this picture, you'll see there's no separate fretboard. And so what's going on there, let me see if I've got one here. Guys, I have dragged most of my dusty wood shop here into what I normally keep as a very clean room to show you all these show and tells. So a one-piece neck is basically where normally the neck would be 3/4 inch maple neck shaft with a 1/4 inch fretboard for a total of an inch thickness. It's 1 inch of maple, and we're going to radius and slot this face to become the fretboard. And because there's no convenient fretboard to glue on after we route a truss rod slot, you have to route the slot in the back and then fill it with usually a contrasting piece of wood as a filler strip to plug in there to keep that truss rod in place. So that's the Reader's Digest intro to one-piece necks. I tend not to make them because they're that extra bit of work, but I also tend to like darker fretboards, and that's just a personal preference. But there can be a little extra effort required to make a one piece. They sometimes, especially if you're making a vintage style, they have a curved truss rod, and there's some jiggery pokery involved in getting the curve correct and filling the slot properly. But in a nutshell, that's the guts of what and how you make a one-piece neck. Let me see if someone's asking any questions here. I either get people who don't care for one-piece necks, or people jump on them and think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. All right, cool. Looks like we're clear. There's lots of chatter in the chat today. That's great. All right, so moving on. Here's another one that I get some questions about, especially as they pertain to my templates. So let me take a little side trip here. Neck through designs. If you're not familiar, don't have a separate neck. The neck and the center section of the guitar are all one great big long piece of wood. And then you glue wings on either side of where the body is to form what looks like a normal guitar. And I have never built a set neck. Full disclosure, they're not my jam. Although I do like vintage Firebirds. I think they're pretty cool guitars. If I ever built one, I would probably make a set neck or a bolt on. But that's the 1, 2, 3 on a set neck. They can be a little bit complicated, especially if you're planning to use a bridge that requires a neck angle, because again, if it's all one piece of wood, something needs to be angled. So now you have to plane an angle in part of that wood, which can get a bit tricky. And the bottom half of my slide here, you'll see that one of the questions I got was someone who was asking, how do you cut that puzzle piece to connect the neck to the body? You don't. Please don't try. That is just something that I do to make the templates smaller for shipping purposes. Otherwise, I would need an enormous box to ship those templates to you. But if you snap that puzzle piece together, that forms the template for the one long piece of wood that is both the neck and the center of the body. Any neck through builders or want to build a neck through, let me know in the chat. That would be cool. And if you do, let me know what it is. I'd be cool. It'd be very cool to see if it's not a Firebird. All right. Oh, another complicated one. This one's gonna, I need a sip to launch into this one. So conversion necks. Well, before I launch into conversion necks, let me just do a quick recap. Scale length is basically, let me grab a guitar here. Just a recap. Scale length is the distance from the face of the nut to the saddles on the bridge. So with a conversion neck, what we're trying to do is take this, for example, 25.5-inch scale guitar and change its scale length. And it's not as simple as just get yourself or make another scale length neck and bolt it on, because even though the scale length and the fret spacing are most of what dictates the scale length, the layout of the body also contributes to that. So if we go back to our slide, what is a conversion neck? It lets me turn a guitar of one scale length into another scale length. So to make that more concrete, if I have a 25.5-inch scale Telecaster, and I decide it would be cool to make that into a 24.75-inch scale, like a Gibson scale Telecaster, you can't buy or make a standard 24.75-inch scale neck bolted on there and off you go. And the reason for that is the nut and fret spacing and the length of the neck of that neck you just bought are meant to go on a body laid out to be 24.75-inch scale. So how do you change the scale of an existing guitar? Something has to move. In this case, it's 25.5 inches from the nut to the bridge. We either need to bring this nut closer to the bridge, we need to move the bridge closer to the nut, or technically we could move this neck pocket deeper into the body. And that would be to put a shorter scale on it. You could also make it longer. We usually don't want to move the bridge because that means plugging and filling holes and trying to repaint, and that never works out well. And moving a neck pocket is almost impossible. If you moved it closer to the bridge to make a shorter scale, then you would probably bump into the neck, the pickup in the neck position. And if you pushed it further away, you'd start to run out of neck pocket to hold on to the neck. So all of this has been a long-winded explanation to say a conversion neck is a hybrid neck that has had some magic done to it that just makes all that work nicely. And I do have templates to help you do that. It can be a difficult concept to wrap your head around until it clicks. And then when it clicks, you say to yourself, well, duh, that seems really simple. So let me just show you a couple of templates here. So this is a standard, I've got to make sure which one is which. This is a standard 25.5-inch scale length telly neck template. So there's the nut, there's the heel, and this is a 24.75-inch conversion neck template. So the first thing you'll notice, the heel is the exact same size, so it fits perfectly in your telly's neck pocket. The next thing you'll notice is the nut on the telly neck is here, and on the conversion neck, it's here. So we've moved the nut closer to the bridge. The other important part of scale length is the fret spacing. So you have to use new fret spacing, but you also have to make a separate fretboard and slide it along towards the bridge. And then you get this overhang. And that's the thing with conversion necks. You either, I shouldn't say either, you sometimes end up losing a fret if you're making a shorter scale, or if you're trying to make a longer scale, you sometimes end up adding frets. So it's hard to wrap this up in a bow, but a conversion neck is a hybrid neck that is neither one or the other. It melds two dissimilar parts, one scale from another neck and a body that had a different scale to start with. You know, even as I say that, that sounded confusing as hell. Let me know in the chat if that was confusing as hell. If we have any more questions about them later, I'll try and tackle them. All right, let's roll on here to laminate necks. This one, I got a few questions and they were pretty much all the same. Why and is there any advantage? The why is in some cases because it looks nice, and in some cases there is some advantage. I'm seeing some questions in the chat here. Sorry, I got distracted. What type of wood can I practice with? Well, we touched on that a bit earlier here. You may have answered this, but what type of wood can I practice with? You can practice with pine, poplar, even plain maple will do. Pat says clear as mud. Yeah, I know, it's quite a concept. My guess is that if it's making your mind boggle thinking about conversion necks, Pat, then they're probably not something that you were interested in anyway. Personally, I would rather have a 24.75-inch scale guitar and a second one that's 25.5. I don't really need to mix and match, but it's cool. A lot of people do like to do that. All right, so let's jump back on laminate necks here. And the why, again, was in some cases it looks nice. You can see an example here, but it just occurred to me I have this actual guitar right here with me. So this is a laminate neck, and you can tell there's a tiny little pinstripe up the center. So I didn't do this laminate so much to be showy, but I split this maple plank in half and put a tiny thin black veneer up the center. I thought rather than worry if someone would see the joint line, I would lean into a bit and try and add just a little touch of class to it. But the why I did it, I actually have a few blanks that I haven't used from the same batch as that guitar. And let me see if I can show you this. If you look at this, there's two pieces of maple and that black veneer up the center. And the maple is perfectly quarter sawn. But it didn't start out that way. It was actually a wide piece of flat sawn maple. And I split the flat sawn in half, turned each half on its side to get the quarter sawn orientation, and then glued it back together. And so that's one of the reasons that you might make a laminate neck, is to make a stronger piece of wood. Typically, when you glue up multiple pieces, you end up with a stronger blank. Another reason is, as I say, decorative. I've seen 3, 5, I've seen 12-piece laminates because they look quite flashy. That's not really my thing, but it's certainly, the strength is undeniable. And let's see if anybody's got any questions. I'm looking in the start here. Let's see. Oh, there's all kinds of good questions here. I may have to tackle these later. Pat, you've got a question coming up about a built-in neck angle or cut a scarf joint. Well, we'll talk about scarf joints in a minute. Hang on, Pat. I promise you, I've probably got more than you want to hear on scarf joints coming up. Let's roll on past laminates to headstocks. This one is easy. For me, anyway. I often get people asking, is one better than the other? I mean, that's like asking what is the best sandwich. Everybody will have an opinion. I like both. I use 3+3 tuners and angled headstocks, and I use Fender style headstocks too. One thing that I do when I use them, just to make it familiar for customers, when you're building guitars to sell, you want to sort of stretch your creative wings, but you also need to remember that you're catering to people who have very specific preferences. So I tend to use a Fender style headstock on a 25.5-inch scale guitar, and I often make them bolt on. And I'll use the 3+3 tuner arrangement and an angled headstock on a 24.75-inch scale guitar, and I often make those set neck. So they feel quite familiar, and even if I wrap my own body shape around them, they still feel like something you may have played before. So better or worse, I'll let the internets debate that, but personally, I like them both. All the music I've loved for my entire life has been played on both of these. So let me know in the chat if you have a preference and why. I'd love to know. Maybe I'm missing something. And so here it is, as I promised, scarf joints. But you know what? I just saw a question pop up, and before we move on, I'm going to tackle it. David is asking about dissimilar woods in a laminate neck. So if you'll see some people will take maple and they will make strips of walnut or other contrasting wood. And the concern can be different woods move in different ways in humidity, and will you ever feel the glue joints between those pieces of wood? And that is a very real possibility. As I say, I don't do a lot of laminate necks, but I can say that I have noticed that frustratingly, you'll find that the seams in body blanks will occasionally they can telegraph through your beautiful glossy paint job, and there's nothing more frustrating. With the neck, you tend to be using more stable woods, hopefully in the same grain orientation, and they tend to be tighter grained than body woods. So it's less of a problem, but it's not impossible, David. So that is a great question. Be aware of that. All I can say is practice or make a few practice blanks and see what becomes of them. So many questions here. The chat's on fire today. This is great. All right, let's tackle scarf joints, because I think this one could take a bit of time. So let's go full screen and I'll show you some beautiful artwork that I made for you here. So a scarf joint, for anyone who hasn't made one or is not familiar with them, is basically where you take a single piece of wood, you make a very steep angled cut in it, and then use the end that you cut off flipped over as the headstock. And that sounds like a mouthful. So let's have a look at the pictures here. Hopefully I can make it make sense as we go. So the image you see at the top that says cut and flip, imagine that is a piece of maple that's 3/4 of an inch thick. And that's your neck blank that you might start making a Fender neck out of. And then you cut a really sharp angle somewhere in the between 10 to 15 degrees in it. And so we've cut off the blue piece, the smaller piece that you see on the right. If you rotate that piece and glue it back onto the green piece, then you end up with, let's start with option A, the next picture. That is effectively the angle that you cut the little piece off at, let's say 10 degrees. When you flip it over and glue it back on, you've just magically, instantly made a 10-degree headstock angle, which is fantastic. And the cool thing about this is you didn't have to buy a giant log of wood that was thick enough to cut that angled headstock out of in the first place. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, Mike, why are there 2 more images here? That seemed pretty simple. The next picture that you see, option B, might look a lot the same as A, but if you look at it carefully, A has the blue headstock piece glued to the underside of the green, we'll call it the neck shaft. And B has the headstock piece glued on the top side of the green neck shaft. And what difference does that make? It's not a huge difference. Some people, there are camps that swear by one or the other. Personally, I like option B here. And B, if you look at it, you'll notice that the blue headstock piece is sandwiched between the neck shaft and the fretboard. And that just means there's a ton of glue surface that is holding that whole thing together and makes it incredibly strong. The black lines that you see in all these images are the grain direction. And you'll notice that you don't have any what we refer to as short grain. And by way of example, if you look at the last image, that would be a typical one-piece neck where instead of making a separate headstock that you glued on, you just cut it all out of one piece of wood. So notice right where the end of the fretboard is and about where the nut would be, there are some really short bits of grain there. And what I mean by that is if you were going to think of the layers on an onion, or if you were, I don't know, if you were carving, what do you carve? Stone, or if you were trying to cleave a diamond, it will split along a fault line. So there's a very short fault line there, and that's why you get so many so-called Gibson headstock snaps. It's very short grain, and all guitar necks are quite thin at that point. So you'll see I made a few points here. A scarf joint uses less wood. There are some decorative options. I haven't checked, but I'm guessing that someone in the chat is asking me how you do those cool scarf joints with contrasting woods. So before you glue that blue piece back on, if you slip a piece of veneer or some other contrasting wood in there and glue it up, when you carve the neck profile, it will reveal itself in all kinds of very cool sort of swoopy boomerang shapes. I've seen incredibly complex designs made with scarf joints. And you'll see people make them not necessarily here. They'll actually push them further up the neck towards the 2nd and 3rd fret so that they can get more layers of dissimilar colored wood in there. And then that brings up the whole question of that we had earlier about, do dissimilar woods move differently and can you feel them? And I've never gone to that extent to make anything that complex. And in fact, I kind of don't make scarf joints anymore. A lot of my customers lean more toward vintage style builds, and that particular group of people love one-piece necks. So I do a lot of one-piece necks. Or I do on my own, not necessarily vintage inspired models, I do laminate necks, and that lets me do this, where this was my laminate again with the pinstripe, but I glued this up into a very thick block out of which I got 2 of these nested together. And so by nested together, I mean one is the neck and the headstock like this, and the other is the neck and the headstock like this. So there's less waste. That tends to be what I do as opposed to scarf joints these days. Before we roll on, I've actually got a little bit more on scarf joints here. I just want to make sure there are no questions here. Tony says, I've heard that they usually get a veneer. Yes, so one of the things that you can do with a in conjunction with a scarf joint is glue what's called headstock ears on. So you can use a narrower blank and take some of the scrap and glue ears on, because of course the headstock is wider than the fretboard. And part of hiding all of those sins, front and back of the headstock, you can use a paper thin veneer or even a little bit thicker veneer. On the back, it's usually referred to as a back strap. And what that ends up doing is it kind of looks classy because you're using a contrasting color, but it also hides the glue joint for those ears almost all the way around. And the more wood glue surface over the glue joints you have, the stronger you're making that neck. So let me know if that wasn't what you were going for, Tony, but that definitely is very common in the world of scarfed headstocks. So how do you cut those really steep angles, you're probably asking yourself. And the answer is it's tricky. If you've got a miter saw, then you probably know that 45-degree angles for, I don't know, a picture frame are super easy, but 10 degrees is just way too steep. There's no easy way to do that. You'll see a picture on the left here of a jig that I designed, and you'll find it on my website. And in fact, in the bottom left corner here, though, you could make your own very easily. You'll see what I used for years, and it's basically just a piece of plywood with a 2x4 screwed to it at a perfectly placed whatever angle I wanted at the time. It might have been 10 degrees. And that has a runner on the bottom, and I run it through my table saw, and that slices those angles nicely. And then you probably can't see, there's a little thing on the end that I hacked it with because I needed a different angle one day, and it just flips out, and now I have a second angle. And then for whatever reason, probably a customer asking for something specific, I needed another angle one day, and that's when I said, okay, I'll design something that's a little more flexible than this. So the jig in the main part of the photo is adjustable from 10 to 17 degrees, 17 being the scary degree headstock angle that Gibson uses. And I designed this jig to cut the angle out of a large blank of wood for a one-piece neck. So if you look at the two other pictures on top, you'll see what I mean by nesting two necks together in one blank. So there's two necks that I've cut out of there. The squiggly cuts are bandsaw cuts where it didn't matter, and the perfect cuts that you see in the bottom right photo were cut with this jig. And all that was a long-winded way of saying I didn't design this to cut scarf joints, but so many of my customers have used it to do just that with a little bit of ingenuity. You can put a spacer between the piece of wood and the fence. You can move the runner over. You can use this on a table saw, on a bandsaw. But the real takeaway here, this is not a plug for the jig, is that you need some kind of a jig to help you get that very precise angle. And even when you cut it, you'll still need to clean it up quite a bit before it's usable. That glue joint has to be so perfect because it's so visible, and it's so critical that it be strong. All right, comments. How are we doing here for comments? Looks like we're good. I may tackle some of these at the end. I want to keep rolling because we've got a few slides to go here. I want to make sure I get to everyone's questions. The next question I got was about drilling tuner holes. And it was specifically about how do you prevent blowout, or how do you drill precisely? And the answer to that is if you are able to, you should use a drill press. You're going to wobble if you use a hand drill. And you'll notice that I point out here that even if you're using a drill press, you should clamp the neck in place. But the best tip that I can give you is that for a Fender style neck, you want to drill the tuner holes from the back of the headstock, and you want to drill them before you have thinned the headstock and created the headstock ramp. And that way, if you've drilled from the back and you do get some blowout on the top, it really won't matter because you'll cut that away when you cut you thin the headstock and cut the headstock scoop. So that's just an order of operations things that you can absolutely do. For an angled headstock, that's a little bit trickier. There's no way to lay this flat on a drill press and drill them. So you kind of have to drill them from the back side as well. And when you drill from the back, you're not necessarily going to thin this. So you can't, like on a Fender style neck, you have no way to remove the blowout that way. So the best solution for that is to, you see, let me get a bigger version going here. You see in here, I have a jig. Actually, I brought this jig in from the shop to show you. Maybe I should go like this. The point of this jig is twofold. One is the face of the headstock is pressed against something. So that's what I mean by a backer board. That way, when you drill through the back and out the front of the headstock is pressed against something. And that's just sort of old school woodworker trick. You won't blow it out if it's pressed against something. But then as an added bonus, this is a jig that I created for drilling headstock tuner holes on an angled headstock. And if you look in the picture, you'll see I've got a spare piece of plywood clamped to my drill press table. And what you can't see is I have a dowel pin in it lined up with the drill bit. So this jig slips over that dowel pin. So I precisely locate the holes. And the nice thing is, in my case, I've routed a recess here to hold the headstock still so it won't wobble around and make oversized holes. The first version of this I made, what I actually did is if you don't have the ability to make that beautiful recess with a CNC, is to keep the scrap. Let me come back full screen here. Keep the scrap when you cut out the shape of your headstock. Keep these leftover bits. And you can screw those down to the jig base on the outside of the headstock area, and that will keep it from moving just as easily. That's what I did for years before I started making these. And so that takes care of the wobble, that takes care of the blowout, and life is good. I see Zeke here says that's a really smart jig. I might have to borrow that idea. Borrow away. I don't claim any of these are necessarily original. I have done a lot of shop tours and I've spent a lot of time combing through factory YouTube videos. Most of us can't afford the incredible automation that factories have, but I get incredibly inspiring ideas on how they do things and how I can apply that to my own shop. So anything you see here or that might be useful, you feel free to ask about. Oh, here's Pat. Well, Pat's asking, how do you do something like that without a CNC? Well, as I say, Pat, for years before I did that, I just kept the offcuts from the headstock. And so if the headstock, the side of a headstock is swooped in, keep those swoops, press them up against a headstock, screw them down, and now that headstock will not wobble, and it's just as sturdy. All right, let's keep rolling here on to truss rods. So truss rods, there are a lot of truss rod questions. I've tried to sort of distill them into some categories here. So basically there are two types of truss rod, and maybe before I start, I should explain just briefly. Your guitar, when you string it up to pitch, you're turning the tuners, putting more tension on the strings. So you're basically trying to turn your neck into a fishing rod that is pulling forward. And often we want to try to resist that so that we don't get too much banana happening there. And that's the truss rod's job. And so truss rods come in many, many flavors. I grabbed a few out of the cabinet here for you. So broadly speaking, there are two-way or dual action truss rods, which are basically two rods joined together at both ends. And depending on which way you turn it, it either will, in the center, cause one rod to push up or the other rod to push down. And that is in contrast to, this is a vintage style or so-called single action truss rod. And these guys can only act in one direction. They can't push and pull. So that's the nutshell of the different types of truss rods. How you adjust the truss rod, there are zillions of different options. Some of them use an Allen wrench, some use a screwdriver, some use a spoke wheel like this that you can stick anything in and turn it. The adjustment is how you adjust is not so important as which way and why you adjust. So to get back on the questions, the difference between them and why you might choose them, the dual action truss rod is a modern invention. And some people are trying to build very vintage inspired guitars. And so they want to use a single action truss rod. Some people also feel that because a dual action has two rods, that it's heavier and that impacts the resulting guitar negatively. I've never had any problem with them, and I find these easier to work with. I've used both, and the thing that will directly impact you is when you're making your truss rod slot, a dual action rod requires a nice uniform flat channel. So it's the same depth the whole length of the rod. And that's super easy to route. You just get yourself a the router bit that matches the size of your truss rod, route a slot, and you're good to go. With a single action rod, the way that this works is it has to be placed in a curved slot so that it is bent. And the reason that it has to be bent, I can best tell you with my magic piece of string. If you imagine that fishing rod that is your neck pulling forward, what we need to do is try to pull the headstock back. And the way a truss rod does that is effectively by pushing on the center to make it straighten out. So in order to push, a single action truss rod has a curve in it. And when you tighten it, it's trying just like any nut on a bolt, it's trying to climb up the bolt. But because it's bumping up against the headstock, it can't. So it's actually pulling on the rod. And when it pulls on the rod, it's straightening it. And that straightening is pushing up on the center of your neck. So it's counteracting the fishing rod, which is a good thing. That's exactly what we want. Yay, life is good. Sometimes necks misbehave and actually they don't fishing rod. They go the other way and bend backwards, back bow. And the net of that is your strings end up laying on the fretboard, no bueno. So with a dual action truss rod, you can turn it the other way and it will push the other way and bring the headstock back up and life is good. With a single action truss rod, all you can do is loosen the nut and hope that the strings and the string tension pull it forward. But if it doesn't, and you have literally removed the nut, then you're kind of stuck as far as adjustment goes. So that and the easier truss rod slot is why I prefer to use a dual action rod. And I actually have I have a show and tell here to go back a few slides to show you that this was a practice neck, I think made of poplar. And this was thicker, but I was practicing cutting vintage style truss rod slots that need the curved bottom. And then I split it in half to see how my results turned out. So if you look at this, here's my headstock angle. And then here is my truss rod slot that is deeper in the middle than it is at the ends. And if I balance this on here just so, I might be able to show you that there was the rod sitting straight. Maybe this is a two-hand thing. Here's the rod sitting straight, and the curve that's needed is here. Just that little tiny bit of curve is enough so that when it tightens, it pushes up like that, and it's pushing up on the middle of the fretboard. So there you go. Just to show you that I'm as good as my word. I practiced on cheap wood too. But that was me learning how to build a neck, a vintage style neck with a one-way truss rod, because I had a dealer that wanted a batch of as vintage correct as possible guitars. And so I had to teach myself how to do that. Christopher is asking, what kind of workbench do I use? Well, in here in what I call the clean shop. So you may not have seen this yet, but if you watch my other videos, you'll notice that sometimes I'm in a dusty wood shop up to my knees in sawdust. And sometimes I'm in here in the super clean room. In this workshop, these are some very nice Husky workbenches that I love because they're height adjustable. And they're big, they're huge. So I use those in here. Out in the shop, I'm thinking about rebuilding the bench that I have there, but it is not any sort of fancy cabinetry bench. I literally made the top out of 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood. And the frame is made out of an old deck that I tore down behind my house probably 20 some odd years ago. So I have 4x4 post legs, nothing fancy at all. I'm just checking out the chat here. There's all kinds of great questions. Yes, Jimmy is pointing out that the workbench behind me looks like a Husky brand. I could be a commercial for Husky in here, Jimmy. There's years ago, I would have wanted to build this furniture myself. And now I've realized that the cost of materials probably makes it on par or more expensive to build it myself. And I would still do it if I were doing it as a hobby, because I would have more time to do it. But it was just easier to put these things in place and get back to work. So that's why I look like a Husky catalog right now. All right. So that's the magic of truss rods in a nutshell. Several people asked about carbon fiber rods. I've never used them. I know that it's quite common in base building. I'm not a base builder, but I know some base necks have sometimes even 2 truss rods, but quite often a single truss rod and a carbon fiber reinforcement rod on either side of them. I've never really done that. The one thing I have done, I don't know if I have a sample here. I don't think I do. When I'm making a one-piece neck out of mahogany, this maple is plenty strong, so it's not required. But out of mahogany, what I will sometimes do is route the truss rod slot, but then beside it on either side, I will route another slot, just using the truss rod router bit, and I will run it right past the nut and right out the headstock, and they usually end up coming to about here. And then I'll glue a maple filler strip in there. And what I've done, if you remember back to our short grain picture where a one-piece neck can be a little bit weaker here, is I've run reinforcement through those 2 pieces, so it's harder to snap at this point. But carbon fiber rods are not something I have used to wrap that up. Brian is asking if I've ever put a spoke wheel rod in the heel of a set neck. In the heel of a set neck. You know, I haven't, now that I think of it. In fact, I have a few spoke wheel truss rods here. They are left over from a batch of guitars I built for someone. And I've got a few left, and I've been wanting to experiment with them. I usually make my Fender style necks not adjustable at the headstock because I don't like the little scoop cutout here. It's just a personal preference. So I make them heel adjustable. And what I have done to date is use a heel adjustable truss rod that just works with an Allen wrench. But I like the idea of a spoke wheel, and I often see them visible in the piece of fretboard beyond the last fret. So that's something I think I might experiment with. I do. If you've ever followed me on Facebook, you'll see that I'm always experimenting and tinkering in the skunk works. I have millions of experiments going on. It's always fun to see how things turn out and what works better for the kind of guitar you want to build. All right, so that is truss rods. Fretboards. Fretboards. I've had a few people asking and telling me that part of the reason why neck building seems scary is getting the fret spacing wrong would be awful, because then your guitar wouldn't play well. And how do you get the fret spacing right? And is there math to calculate it? And the short answer is yes, there is math. The long answer is the math is super complex. You can buy lookup tables, but even if you had either or both of those, measuring each distance with a caliper or a ruler and then cutting the slot is not as accurate as just get yourself a fret scale. So I make these, I happen to make them out of acrylic, but I've done all the hard math for you and placed all the slots, different scale on each side. And the way you would use that is, and I'm telling you, I drag so much dust in here, is make a simple sled like this for a table saw or a radial arm saw, or you can even get a manual miter box with a hand saw. But this is the way I do it, and this is just a simple piece of plywood. Got a couple of oak runners on the bottom that fit in my table saw slots. And right here above where the saw cut is, there's a little metal pin in the fence here. So double-sided tape this on the fretboard, sit it on here, slip the fret scale over the pin, run it through the saw, next slot through the saw, so on. And that is the easy way as compared to understanding the math for fret scales. I should check the chat just in case that confused the heck out of anyone, but looks like we're good. Okay, fretboard radiusing comes up a lot. How do you radius a fretboard? And that could be as simple as get yourself a radius block and run that down the fretboard. Now, the thing to be aware of is this nice 12-inch radius block in your human hand is going to wobble as you're sanding, and you're not going to make a 12-inch radius. So I mentioned on here, make a jig or use a jig of some kind. And that could be as simple as make sure that this is up against a straight edge so that when you're moving it, it's held perfectly in line so that it is not wobbling. And that's as simple a jig as you could possibly make. Clamp a straight piece of wood down beside the fretboard that's double-sided tape stuck down somewhere, and sand away, and off you go. You'll find there's a bunch of different ways to do this. In big shops, you'll find a giant belt sander and a swing that hangs above it. And the legs, the arms rather, of the swing, if you wanted a 12-inch radius, they're adjustable, but those arms are 12 inches, and you swing that across the sander, and there you go. You've got a nice angle. My shop is nowhere near big enough to hold that kind of thing. So what I did, and I think I mentioned earlier, I love to watch shop tour videos or tour other people's shops. I think I might have watched a PRS factory tour, and I noticed that they use a giant sanding block like this. And what they do is for touch-ups, when they're leveling the frets, these assembly line guys hold a neck like this and slide it on the block as opposed to sliding a block on the neck. And that sort of stuck with me. That made a lot of sense. but I couldn't figure out how they would keep that straight either. Now, in most cases, they were just doing final leveling of inlays, but the way I solved that riddle, and this is a heavy block, but it's great because it stays put on my bench, is I made this. So it's a little carriage. You can see it's got a center line, and it's got rails on either side. So I double stick tape the fretboard on here face down, pop it on here, and then stays perfectly straight. You don't have to put much weight on it, and you get a nice radius. The only thing I can say is a giant block like that is not something that's easily found. I made mine, and I used a CNC to cut that perfect radius on it. The regular block with a fence, or a fence even on either side, you could probably even MacGyver a handle on here to make this easier to hold on to. That's probably the easiest way to get rolling. You'll see all kinds of router jigs. There are a lot of arched router jigs to rough in the radius. All I will say is those are great. You really need to watch out for chip out on fretboards. And even if you rough in the radius, you need to leave enough material so that you can sand out all the router bit marks to get a nice finished fretboard. So that's radiusing. A compound radius, for folks who don't know, is, in my case, I make my necks with a 12-inch radius. I find I quite like. And so the curvature of the fretboard is a piece of a 12-inch cylinder, and it's the same radius from end to end. A compound radius would have one radius up at the nut and a flatter curve down towards the higher frets. The theory being that you do more bar chords up here, and a nice curve is comfy on the fingers, whereas up here you're doing more wheedly, and so you want it flatter so that you don't fret out and get dead notes happening down there. Making a compound radius is a bit tricky. You can't really sand or plane it in there because it's not a section of a cylinder. If you picture in your head a pipe, and you take a slice off of it, it has a uniform radius. A compound radius is a section of a cone, and you can't easily make a perfect cone. So the way that that's usually done is with a router jig of some kind. And again, it may come back to that swing arm sander business where one of the arms is shorter than the other, and you adjust it so that the fretboard is still perfectly parallel to the sander, but the arms are different, and you rough it in the shape of that cylinder. I see Pat saying that we should rough it in over the top of a cream-colored shag rug. Well, you could try that. I'm not sure how successful that would be, Pat. All right, so the last thing I'll say about compound radius fretboards is don't forget that means when you press, hammer, or otherwise install your frets, you can't level those frets with a nice flat sanding beam, because those frets are also compound radius. So in other words, the first fret is bent more sharply than the higher frets. So it takes a little bit of wherewithal, I would think. I've never built a compound radius neck. But doing the fretwork on one, that would be a question for a repair shop guy, but seems to me that it would be quite a bit more involved. Oh, let's see. I see David's got a question here. Do you always radius before attaching the fretboard to the neck shaft? I don't after, for no specific reason, but like to know your thoughts. I tend to radius the fretboards. As I say, I mount just the fretboard on here, and I radius the fretboard, and then attach that after I've radiused it. You'll find that your process and your order of operations has a lot to do with what tools you have, the kind of guitar, or in this case, neck and fretboard that you're making, and what you're comfortable doing. That's why I enjoy shop tours so much. When I go to a friend's shop, I'll realize that, oh, wow, you do that in a different order than I do. I've never thought of trying that. And you just realize you get into a groove of what works and you stick with it. But I radius first before I glue it on, because it would require a different setup to apply a radius to a fretboard that's already attached to a neck, especially if it's an angled headstock neck. All right, where did we leave off here? This is a good one. Fretboard alignment tips when gluing a fretboard. Again, if I go back to shops, and I think I see this more and more coming to smaller shops. The easiest way to do this is with some kind of an alignment pin. And in big shops, what you'll see is I've got something here I can show you this on, I'm sure. Here, let's say this. If this was a neck waiting for a fretboard, what they will do is they will take a tiny drill bit and drill a hole at either end of the neck shaft, and then they'll drill the corresponding holes in the underside of the fretboard. And they'll put a little tiny, they're usually about an 1/8 inch diameter and maybe an 1/8 inch long metal pin in the neck, slather it up with glue, put the fretboard on, and it positive locks on those pins, and now it can't move, and they glue it up in there. And I'm sure that'll shock the heck out of some of you. Yes, those pins are trapped in there forever. That's an absolute truth. I don't do that, although I think my friend Sully tells me that you can get bags of these pins from McMaster Car now, like a 100 pack of these things. So they're pretty easy to put your hands on. But what I do is instead, when I've got the fretboard glued on, or I'm about to glue it on rather, so it's ready to go, and I've got the fret slots cut in it, I will clamp it in place, no glue, so it's not squirming around, it's just clamped in place. And then I'll take a 1/16 inch drill bit and drill through a fret slot. And I go through the fretboard and into the shaft of the neck. Do that one at each end of the neck. And then that way, when you're ready to do the glue up, slather on your glue, put the dull end, not the business end of that 1/16 inch drill bit through the fretboard holes and find the holes in the neck shaft, and they positive lock into place. The only thing you need to be aware of, and that's where I can show you grabbed one of these out of the shop. This is a matching 12 inch radius clamping caul I made. I've drilled holes through here so that when there are drill bits sticking up out of the face of this while I'm waiting to clamp, this slips over the drill bits and I can clamp all along here. And that fretboard will never move. And that's the, I guess, the poor man's use locating pins process that I use. Let's see how we're doing for questions. David says, I usually rough in my radius with a hand plane, so I find it easier when attached. Yes, I know a lot of people who are much better with hand planes than I am. They'll rough in the radius with a hand plane. That's a great tool for taking off I was about to say the bulk. There's not a lot of bulk on a fretboard, but yes, get really close and then finish it up with a sanding block is a great idea. All right, here is another one. I got so many questions about the giant roundover bits. Before we move on, I see a bunch of questions just flew in here. Rod is asking, I use my neck heel to create my neck pocket template, but I'm not sure if the fit is too tight. Should I shave down the sides of the neck before finishing with tongue oil? Rod, are you finishing the whole thing with tongue oil? So normally what I would say is if it's a set neck that you're about to glue in, you want it snug, it shouldn't wiggle, but you absolutely don't want it so tight that when you press it in, it will scrape all the glue off. And just in case I don't want to make sure I misunderstood, but if it is glued in, do not apply oil before you glue it in. Like the oil will prevent the glue from creating a proper glue joint. Hopefully that's what you were going for. Okay. Giant router bits. Giant router bits are a thing that I've always been aware of, but they seem to be becoming more popular now. So you'll see on screen here, let me bigify this for you. In the upper right is it's hard to tell, there's nothing there for scale, but that is a 1-inch roundover bit. It's huge. And the question is using that to route the back of your neck, your neck profile. Is that a good thing? It's a great thing, but on the other hand, it also terrifies me. That is a huge router bit, and they are really meant to be used in an overhead pin router. So first things first, you could never use one of these things in a handheld router. And even in a table router where you are running, let me bigify myself here, where you are. So what we're talking about is using a roundover bit to make this radius on the back of the neck. Trying to run this through a router table with your hands this close to that spinning giant bit terrifies me. Normally it's done with the neck mounted on a jig where your hands are over here holding a handle a mile away from that bit, and you pass it under a pin router. But some things to think about here are, first of all, a 1-inch radius is huge. And second of all, your neck is thinner here at the nut end than it is at the heel end. So what you might have to do is make a sled that holds it, and that holds the nut area up a little bit higher so that you end up a little bit thinner. But then you also need a template that makes the bit follow a template to go closer to the center of the neck here. And now the two halves of the 1-inch profile don't meet perfectly. They meet sort of like this. So yes and no, it can take off a lot of meat and then you can get right to the final carving. But what I would suggest is usually people are asking this question because they're trying to avoid the carving. If you haven't carved and you don't understand the shape that you're going for, the router bit is not magic. And the other thing I will warn you is, you see I've got a note here. We talked about this in routing out a body, but the direction of the turn of the router bit on one side of the neck is going in a friendly direction, and it's cutting the grain nicely and life is good. Cutting the other side, it's trying to grab the grain, and there's opportunity for blowout or to launch the thing. So what I would suggest is for your first neck, don't go near this, but certainly consider it if you've got some experience carving a neck and you can still see the final profile that you want after you've used the 1-inch radius to take the bulk of the wood off. I will tell you, I have 2 little tidbits that I can share with you. When you're not under the gun to make a batch of guitars, if you don't sell guitars professionally, carving a neck is one of the most awesomely therapeutic things I have ever done, and I still love to do it. There's no power tools running in the shop. You've got some music on and a cup of coffee, and you're shaving away with a blade. It's just a wonderful thing. You're sculpting out of wood, and it's very, I love it. The other interesting thing in the other camp is, on a shop tour I did years ago, I know a builder who was renowned for building 1959 Les Paul style replicas, and people loved the neck profiles that he built, saying that, he had cracked the code, they're so accurate. And in touring that shop, and I've seen this in other shops as well, I noticed that he had, in addition to a router table, he had a shaper table. And if you're not familiar with a shaper, you would find it in a cabinet shop, or a shop that does stairs and moldings and railings. It's basically a 3, 4, 5 horsepower motor and a belt-driven router bit, as opposed to you put a bit in a router and it sits in a router table under its own weight. These things are monster machines where you could run a 2-inch diameter railing through it and put a decorative curve on it. And I noticed that he had one of these things, and he had a giant 1-inch radius bit. And that was the aha moment where I said to myself, well, of course, in 1959, Gibson didn't have an army of Michelangelos who were whittling Les Paul necks. They had a shaper and a giant router bit, and they did this with the tools that were available to get the job done as fast as they could. So there's a little bit from both camps. That's probably how it's always been done. And on the other hand, it's just a beautiful, quiet time in your shop. Carving a neck is just awesome. Yes, Pat says, I find hand carving very cathartic. That's a great word for it. It's just it's the one part of a guitar that's not necessarily flat, and you get to put some artistic effort into it, and I find it's quite a lot of fun. I've also got some pictures here of some hand tools I should bigify this for you. The bottom left is a dragon rasp. These things are just beautiful. I need to put my hands on another one of these, but they are great for sculpting wood. And on the right is a spoke shave, which I have often used. And they are great. One is sort of grinding away wood, and the other is a blade that is carving away wood. With both of them, you need to be aware that when you're carving a neck by hand, we humans will have a tendency to introduce waves in here that we don't necessarily want. So what you need to do is get good at shaping very close to the final that you want. But then what you can do is look, whoops, let me find a better way to get here, is consider using a sanding block. And that's how you can finalize the shape with a nice flat and straight block. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but if we go on to the next picture, you'll see I grabbed this off the internet. I think this is Bill Sheltima, who I chatted with when he created this jig. It is possible to rough in the profile using a router. And the way that this jig in a nutshell works is you've got two different sort of patterns at either end of the jig. The neck gets attached to the jig, and it's like a rotisserie chicken. It wheels back and forth over the router bit and will rough it in. What you'll find is that it does only the shaft and none of the tricky bits here behind the nut or at the heel. So that's cool. That's helpful. Again, that's about removing the bulk of the wood, and then you finalize by hand. So my advice is always be super safe if you're going to use any router contraption, be it the giant bit or the jig. And I suggest that you try to learn to shape by hand first, because the jig or the router bit is not magic. It doesn't have the shape in it, and it doesn't do it for you. So you need to know how to make the shape first, and then you can look for ways to make it easier to make the shape. And you'll notice I've got a video of mine up on screen here where I'm showing you in that video how to make long flat sanding blocks with the paper that doesn't keep folding or falling off, and how to make cylindrical blocks that are important for doing curves and radiuses behind the neck and the nut. You'll see a picture here of me with a neck on a fixture in a clamp so that I can get at the back of the nut area and finalize it. That's all part of that wonderfully therapeutic, you're carving, you're an artist at work kind of thing. So that brings us to frets. People ask if they should glue in frets. Yes, you should. And the reason that you should is that when you press those frets in there, there are little barbs. The end profile of a fret, I'm sure this is too teeny to see, is the nice mushroom cap, and the stem is what slips down into the fret slot. And that stem has barbs on it that try to hold on to the wood. But as the wood shrinks and swells with the seasons, sometimes that hold can loosen up and a fret can pop up. So what we're doing when we're using glue in a fret slot is not trying to bond the fret to the wood. You're just trying to fill up all that space in there so that if the wood tries to move, there's still enough glue in there to hang on to the fret. Production shops will use CA glue, super glue, and they'll squirt it in from the side and let it trickle down. I don't do that because I find there's a lot of cleanup afterwards. You end up having to scrape the fretboard with a razor blade, and I don't enjoy that at all. But what I do is I use just regular old Titebond. You can put a little, so the order of operations is a little bit different. When I'm fretting, I will put, you can see me, this is an old picture. You can't see my fret press off to the right, but what I'll do is put a strip of masking tape on either side of the fret slot, use a toothpick, put a little bit of Titebond in that slot, then take the tape off, press the fret in, move on, do the whole neck. The only thing I will say is when you're using Titebond, because it's wood glue, you need to let it set up. I usually let it set up till the next day before I do the fretwork. In reality, it's probably days later because I'm doing a batch of them and it takes me a while to get to it. But the point is, super glue, you can get right to the fretwork more quickly, but more cleanup required. And Titebond, no cleanup required, and you just need to let it sit for a bit before you do the fretwork. The next fret sort of related question that I got a couple of times. I don't know if these were people who'd seen me at a guitar show or not, but it was how to make the sexy rolled fretboard edges. People who've played, actually this one, I don't think this one has been rolled yet, but people who've played my guitars have said that they feel sort of like their favorite pair of worn in jeans because between the frets, the fretboard is nice and smooth and round to the touch. You can't sand that in. Don't try to sand it. You'll remove too much material and you'll be surprised, I'm sure, when I tell you that the secret is to use a screwdriver and hold the wrong end of the screwdriver and hold it at a 45-degree angle and just press hard on the fretboard between the frets and round over the wood. That's a really old woodworker's trick that I learned a million years ago. When you want a sharp edge on something, a coffee table or a night table or something, but you don't want it literally sharp enough that you would cut yourself on it, you can burnish the edge of that wood. So you're not removing material, but you're rounding it over and it feels just smooth. It's on a fretboard, you'll find it feels amazing. Anyway, that's the secret. Don't tell anyone except the whole internet. This one I can't answer for sure because I don't do this at all, but on a Gibson-style guitar, a Les Paul, that Flying V, what have you, that has binding on the fretboard, the Gibson method is to stop the frets at the edge of the wood of the fretboard, and the binding follows the fretboard, but it also raises up at each fret, and it's like the continuation of the fret itself. And I believe the way that is done is with a file. I think I've seen a video where someone tried to run a neck on edge like this along a router bit, ba-bump, 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 to remove the extra material. I wouldn't try that if I were you. But as I say, I absolutely don't do that. And to be quite honest, I'm not a huge fan of the look. I would rather have binding with the fret, the top of the fret extending to the edge of the binding anyway. But that I have no better answer than file for you. And here's a fretwork tip I'll leave you with. People don't believe me when I say this, but I say this in all honesty. When you finish making your neck and you've probably applied finish to it, and you've painted your body and you bolt that on or glue that in your guitar and you're ready to string it up and do fretwork, that brand new neck that you just made still thinks it's a tree. I absolutely recommend that at that point you probably haven't done the intonation or the fretwork yet, but put a set of strings on it and tune it up to pitch just so the open notes play. It may not fret properly yet. You haven't done the fretwork, but you need to put it under the string tension that it's going to live under for the rest of its life, and then put it aside and let it sit for a while. How long? I would say at least a couple of days. In my world, I get busy and I end up putting them aside, and I probably come back to them a week later. But what you're trying to do is let that neck finish doing whatever it's going to do, because what you're trying to avoid is you put the neck on, you do all the fretwork, and it plays beautifully today, but it's only been under string tension for the hour that you've been doing fretwork. And then if it should happen to move further, then all your beautiful fretwork was for nothing and you have to do it again. So that's one of my number one tips. String it up, put it aside, go do something else. Go build another guitar. You heard it here first. I've authorized you to build another guitar while you're waiting for your first guitar to work out its kinks. So that, is going to do it for my answers to the questions that I got ahead of time. Let me know in the chat how we're doing here. If you've got any questions about anything I've said. We're rolling pretty hard on time here, but let's see if we can look at a few more things. Jimmy says, getting ready to do my first neck and wanted to do a conversion neck and ordered your templates. That's cool, Jimmy. Thanks. What are you converting from what to what? And while I'm waiting for Jimmy, I'll see if there's anything else happening here. I see Enzo says he prefers a rasp and he likes to feel the shape as it's coming along, something really satisfying. Well, I'll tell you, Enzo, I'm absolutely in agreement with you. And I'll tell you another thing is you're absolutely right. When you are shaping by hand, the changes are happening much more slowly. So it's harder for something to go bad wrong in a hurry. If you're using a router bit or a jig of some kind, you can go from everything is okay to you're having a really bad day very quickly. And quite honestly, as I say, it's just a lot more fun to shape by hand because you feel like you're actually making the shape happen there slowly. You're whittling from nothing to something. Pat says, how do you put the bulletins on fretwork? Bulletins. Pat, are you talking about the rounded fret ends, like semi-hemispherical, I think they're called? You'll let me know and we'll catch up. Jimmy says he's doing from 25.5 inch to 25 inch scale. So you're going from sort of a Fender-y thing to a PRS thing. That's cool. I'm a fan of shorter scales. I've played with 24 inch. I think that's probably the shortest I've played, and I find I quite like them. I've never played a proper 25 inch PRS anything. So that's an interesting, I'd love to see if I can wrap my brain around it. It's probably close enough to Fender scale that it wouldn't, I have a friend who absolutely cannot play anything Gibson scale. He insists that his fingers and his brain are wired for 25.5 inch Fender scale. Oh, Pat, you're very welcome. David, I'm glad I could help. That's awesome. Yeah, I find, as I said earlier, this is a great way for us to chat. The guitar building community is fairly big, but we tend to work in silos. So getting together like this to be able to talk with people who get it is always awesome. This has been a whole lot of fun. Let's see if we've got any more questions here before we wrap up. Brian is asking, before you assemble the neck, how close do you get the wood to the template size? If I understand what you're asking me, Brian, so I would route the, let me see what I've got for show and tell here that I can show you. So if this were this is a one-piece blank, but if this was the maple shaft for a separate fretboard blank, this would be exact template size. And I would get the fretboard to exact size. And again, in the order of operations I mentioned, that's just my order of operations, and different people do this differently. I've seen people who route the truss rod slot and glue the fretboard on a still rectangular piece of wood. And that has never been my process. I think I probably had concerns earlier on about what if I've got the truss rod in here, but then when I attach the template, I do this, and now the truss rod is not centered correctly or something. But so in other words, I would have an exact size fretboard, and with locating pins, I would attach it to this exact size neck shaft. So they are perfect on the edges. Hopefully that's what you meant. Chris is asking, do you drill 1/8 inch holes in the template for marking, or are they 3 millimeter? I use 1/8 inch drill bits for those holes in the template. And again, that's not necessarily the size of the final size of the hole that belongs there. That is just for you to locate the hole position and then drill at whatever size you want. But if you're trying to match them exactly, they're 1/8 of an inch. Let's see what else we've got here. I think we're pretty good here for questions. All right. Well, before we go, I want to ask you guys, what was the most valuable thing that we talked about today that's useful to you? And, let me know in the chat. And if we run out of time and the stream ends, then hop over to the comments and leave a comment there. In fact, if you could do that, that'd be great. I'll see you next time.